moving on to our first and big story. Even if you're not a space fan, you've probably heard about this. I had various members of my family calling me up and saying, what the heck's happening up in space? As you probably know, we talk about space debris a lot on this show because it is a really, really important thing. The impacts that space debris has on astronomy, astrophysics, scientific research, on launch systems, on Earth monitoring. We've just come out of the COP26 climate talks in Glasgow, and the impact of how many degrees the planet's going to warm up has not escaped anybody. And a lot of the monitoring of that relies on satellites, and a lot of our infrastructure relies on satellites, communications, shipping, navigation, all sorts of things. So we kind of have a bit of a bugbear, well, I do in particular, about people like Elon Musk with Starlink. Whilst he's doing great stuff with his own launch systems with Starship, etc. We've always said this, really, really fantastic. Starlink is a real problem. Growing number of satellites. We're looking at FCC filing data this week. From all accounts, it looks like there's filings being made for 94,000 satellites to be in orbit within the next 10 to 20 years. Now, given that there are currently 4,550 active satellites in orbit, and around about anywhere between 131 million and 178 million pieces of debris, that's a lot of a problem growing. And whilst this is an exponentially growing problem that everybody is kind of becoming more and more aware of, this week something happened which brought this very much into the public spotlight. Our lovely friends over in Russia. Now, the Russian space agency, Roscosmos, again, they do fantastic things. They've been delivering, cosmonauts and astronauts and people, even Britain's Tim Peake up to the International Space Station for a long time. Some of the most fantastic launch systems and reliable launch systems ever developed. Obviously, during the 1970s, they had the Venera program, did some fantastic work on Venus and Venusian surface. We're not having a go at the Russian space program. We're having a go at the Russian space weaponization program, which appears to be gaining pace. Between what's happening in the Ukraine, if you've not seen the news, Russia are amassing tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of troops on the Ukraine border. There's all sorts of issues in Eastern Europe, Belarus, etc. But this was the big one from our perspective in terms of space. So this week, Russia decided to blow up a satellite in orbit using a surface-launched missile system. This was an A235PL-19 Nudol ASAT system, which launched out of Russian territory, flew up into a reasonably low Earth orbit. I say reasonably low, it's 485 kilometers. So round about the altitude of the International Space Station, funnily enough. And they decided to wipe out a 1,750 kilogram satellite. Now, they're not the first country to do this. We've got to play fair here and say, the first country to actually do this with the United States, and there was international condemnation over that. It was a really stupid thing, and America kind of took a major slap on the wrist, and they're not going to do it again. Then China launched one, and they did their own ASAT test, and again, that got international condemnation. And a few years ago, India decided to do one, and that got massive amounts of international condemnation, and India were trying to defend it. And I remember having running battles with some of the Indian armed forces over this. It was really quite bad, literally running battles via social media, where they were saying one thing and I was basically proving them wrong. Some of the debris from that is still in orbit and at very, very high altitudes. And this is the thing, when you hit something, it kind of obliterates in every direction. So what's happened is this ASAT test basically hit a satellite that the Russians launched when they were still the Soviet Union in the early 1980s. It's called Cosmos 1408, and this is what's called an ELINT satellite. So this is a signals intelligence kind of surveillance satellite. And a couple of days ago, day or so ago, confirmation comes through that this thing had fragmented. And for a while, the Pentagon and various other people weren't saying much about a lot of space science and on the ground tracking capabilities. Companies like Leo Labs, Norse, etc., were saying this is an explosion. This is a catastrophic explosion. And it came to light that it was this ASAT test. Now, when I say catastrophic explosion, the initial tracking data coming out of this is showing that it's broken up into over 1,560 trackable pieces. The information coming out of the Pentagon, that was basically, they did a big press conference, indicates that there are hundreds of thousands of smaller pieces that have come off this satellite. The Indian ASAT test was a much smaller collision, much smaller satellite. This is a huge, relatively huge satellite. 1,750 kilograms is a significant satellite. You hit that, it's going to create an unholy mess. What then transpired is, because of the orbit, its orbit intersects that of the International Space Station. So the ISS astronauts had a rather ominous wake-up call, basically telling them, batten down the hatches, literally batten down the hatches, and get into your escape modules, as it were, i.e. the spacecraft, potentially the Dragon, etc., because you could be coming back to Earth. NASA's ground communications are saying that the possibility was relatively slim, but it was definitely there. And it was almost like watching the movie Gravity unfurl for real. It was literally like, this is actually happening. They're not out of the woods yet. There are still pieces zipping by every 90 minutes. The threat is increasing, if anything, because, as many of the commentators are saying, people like Jonathan McDowell, as I said, Norse, the really, really good high-end space tracking, space situational awareness people are saying, these tiny pieces, don't forget these tiny pieces, which could be maybe a few centimeters, are still traveling at anywhere in the region of 8 kilometers per second. Now, 8 kilometers a second, the kinetic energy of even something that small is enough to go straight through the cupola, for example, on the ISS, and could cause significant damage. There's going to be no EVAs, I would imagine, for a considerable while now, while they ascertain what the actual threat is, because the threat is real. It is intersecting the ISS orbit, and also the Chinese space station's orbit. So, and as this stuff decays, it will be uncontrolled. It'll be an uncontrolled decay from anywhere between 440 to 520 kilometer orbit. So it's not going to decay quickly. This could potentially be up there for decades and just drifting around, untrackable in many cases, and drifting down, gravity, etc., will pull it back down towards Earth. So it will be intersecting other satellites. And as I said at the beginning, we have FCC filings now for 94,000 satellites. So the collision risk just went up a whole set of notches, not even a notch. It's really bad. The impact on astronomy is probably minimal in this case because they are very small debris pieces. The impact on human spaceflight could be literally catastrophic. And you've got to ask the question, does it need somebody to die before anybody pays any attention? We've had strongly worded, and I love that term, strongly worded comments from everyone from Astroscale, who recently conducted the LCD experiment in space, where they basically sent up a mission to try and show how you could remove debris. That mission was hacked into. We won't go into any details, but it was hacked into. So, there's some nefarious people out there anyway. But on top of that, you've got the, NATO, United Nations, the US State Department, etc., all condemning this. But what are they going to do? Because at the moment, as I said, the Russian Federation are massing troops on the Ukrainian border. They are apparently involved in what's happening in Belarus, on the Belarus-Poland border. And now this. So you've got to ask yourself, do they really care? I don't know, Terry. I don't want to go into too much politics, but your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. What's so worrying is that the pieces that they can track, they can obviously move the ISS out of the way. And if an ordinary unmanned satellite, uncrewed satellite gets damaged, it can be replaced and so on. But I'm not sure whether the tracking station tell us the full story, but I believe they can track anything down to about the size of a pack of playing cards, something like that.
About 5 centimeters tracking.
Yeah. Below that, you have pieces the size of, say, a matchbox or a sugar cube. Something like that hitting the ISS, as you have said, it's going to go straight through it. I mean, it is madness. The Russian crew up on the ISS is not just all Europeans and Americans and Japanese and whoever. I cannot fathom it, other than, as you say, the politics to show they can do it. And if they have political aims in Ukraine or wherever, we're letting you know that if you try and interfere, this is what we can do. But I'm straying into pure politics there.
It's worrying.
It's crazy from the point of view of safety.
It's worrying. I mean, you're not going into the politics too much, but the reality is right now, space is dominated by essentially one company, and that's SpaceX. SpaceX have, a good quarter of all of the active satellites in orbit right now, pretty much. And obviously that system is based around internet communications. Starlink is all designed to provide, seamless internet coverage all over the world. And if you've got nation states like China and Russia who literally want to stop people accessing free information, which may be, against their political will, for want of a better term, then what do you do about it? Because Russia have no, imminent plans for a big constellation launch. China have filed, potentially a 13,200 satellite constellation of their own, but right now it's not in orbit. Russia don't have a space station of their own in orbit, so there's that element. Is it kind of, well, look at what we can do, the catastrophic disruption, but the disruption, don't forget, would also impact the Russians and the Chinese. What's more terrifying is if we had a nation state, like a growing nation state such as North Korea, for example, who have recently done things like submarine-based missile launches and intercontinental ballistic missile tests, etc., and are aiming to launch into space. Make no bones about it. You only have to look at what the Germans were doing in 1945 with the V2. They crossed the Kármán line with the V2 in the mid-1940s. That kind of capability will grow. Science, progresses. People can get this information. They can grow and expand on their capabilities. If you had a nation state that didn't really have a big space presence or a big reliance on space, and they were to do something like this, it's really quite worrying. And the impact on space exploration is huge. NASA are about to launch the James Webb Space Telescope. We'll be talking about the Artemis as well in a bit. But there are some really hefty multi-billion-dollar missions aiming to do science or exploration over the coming years. And they've got to punch through this. So we're either going to have to develop space tractors or space plows to get us through it, or something's going to have to change. And it needs to be almost, we've got a moratorium on the use of weapons in space. We've got a moratorium on, a complete ban on the use of weapons of mass destruction in space. But what's a weapon of mass destruction if it's not something that's creating, an inordinate debris cloud that could kill astronauts or could literally wipe out, trillions of dollars worth of communication, etc. And it's not the monetary value, it's the value to Earth observation, to communication, to all the other things that I've said. The impact will be felt by everybody. If we lose space, most of the general public don't realize just how much we rely on space for our everyday living. If we wipe out that capability, we're not going to get fancy pictures from the moon or fancy pictures from Mars or any of the deep space missions. We're going to get nothing. We're going to be back in 1956. So, not good.